Dustin spent time in federal and state prison for drug trafficking and fraud. Upon release in 2006, he had nothing but the clothes on his back, a bag of mail, and legal paperwork. In 2010, he kicked a long-time methamphetamine habit and started the long climb back up the ladder of life. This is the Nowhere to Go But Up podcast. If you want transparency and authenticity, you're in the right place. This is the Nowhere to Go But Up podcast, and this is Sean Dustin.
This is the Nowhere to Go But Up podcast, and I'm your host, Sean Dustin. Thanks for stopping by this evening. If it's your first time watching or listening, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. It's good to have you with us this evening. If you are watching this and you like the software that I'm using, StreamYard, you can use my affiliate link, which is down in the description, and you'll get a $10 discount, and I'll get some dough too once you spend $25, and that'll help support the show. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button in the corner. Thumbs the video up, please. That will definitely help. If you're on Facebook, do me a favor, share and like. If you're on the podcast platforms, which this will be airing tomorrow, Spotify, iTunes, any of the major platforms. Actually, I'm on all the platforms. Go ahead and subscribe there as well. That will help me with visibility across the platforms itself. If you want to support the show monetarily, you can do that as well. In the description, there are all the ways that you can support the show. On my link tree, you can follow that, and you can catch me in all of my social media. Follow me there. You can, tip the show, like I said, either through Cash App, PayPal, any of the sources that I have there. Feel free. And yeah, that's about it. Yesterday we had a good couple of interviews with Monica Perez from the Propaganda Report, and then we also talked to Brian Carpenter, who was a former NFL player. Used to play for the Washington Redskins, which I believe is now the Washington football team. So we had that going. That was a great conversation. And this evening, we have his attorney, Robert L. Jenkins Jr., who's a federal attorney, and he represented Robert. And so why don't we go ahead and bring Robert in, or represented Brian. Why don't we go ahead and bring Robert in? Hey, Robert, how you doing?
I'm doing well. What about yourself?
Not too bad. Got a little tongue-tied there.
Not a problem.
It happens. I would imagine, being an attorney, you're pretty familiar with having to talk to people and stuff like that during trials and all that stuff you have to do to be a good attorney, right?
Yep, it's what I do every day of my life for the last 26 years.
Yeah, so you're a federal attorney out of Washington, D.C., that's correct?
That's correct.
And you have a very, very extensive background. Your pedigree is top notch.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Been at it for a while now.
Okay. And one of the reasons that we decided that you're here is we share an acquaintance, or I don't know if it's an acquaintance to me. Okay. Allie.
Oh yeah.
The publicist.
Wonderful.
Yeah, she's really good. She hit me up, and the moment she said federal attorney, my ears went ding. I'm like, whoa. Because I was talking to my friend Holly, and she should be joining us this evening at some point. She's actually same deal. She did 3 years on a conspiracy charge, white collar crime. Something that she didn't even have anything to do with, other than the fact that she worked there.
That's right.
And got caught up in it. And so that's a huge problem. And the conspiracy charge in itself is so broad.
Yeah.
And the first time that I ever had any, like when I went through my issue with the federal system, I mean, I didn't, they had me dead to rights. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't do anything. Didn't have the money to do it. I just kind of had to accept it. But I mean, I did what they said.
Right.
But when I was fighting my case, and there was a bunch of other folks that were in there, and they were on ghost dope charges, where, you know, some guy got in trouble and decided to put their name in a hat to get some time off their sentence, and they didn't. They had moved on with their life and stopped, you know, doing all that stuff,
Right.
and had regular jobs, and you know that was a period in time in their life where they had made some bad choices, right?
That's right. You see it all every day. You know, you see it every day. People get caught up in the incentive for others to, you know, come up with stories that the prosecutor wants to hear, the federal agents want to hear. You satisfy them. They have ways of doing things for you. So the system kind of feeds off of itself.
And that's not investigative work.
That's right.
That's just hearsay.
Yeah, for the most part it is. But, you know, if they get more than one person to say it, you find yourself in a difficult situation where you don't have the resources to fight back, or you just don't have the evidence to prove your innocence. Now, of course, under our Constitution, we claim that you're innocent until proven guilty, and that you're not required to prove you're innocent, but instead the federal government is required to prove your guilt. But that's just a concept. That's a theory. In the real world, jurors and judges want to hear, if you didn't do what they said you did, then tell me what you did. Prove to me that you didn't do it. That's just the reality of the system that we live in.
Yeah, that's horrible. That's like kind of everything that we're seeing in this world right now, or at least in our country, is what's up is down, what's left is right. Everything seems to be kind of inverted. What we're taught really isn't what it is. It's what's on the backside of it where no one can see.
Yeah. Well, you know, look, the reality of the situation is that the vast majority of people who are eligible to serve on juries come into that courtroom predisposed to believe what the prosecutor is saying. They have this image that the prosecutor is a good guy, the defense attorney and the defendant wear the black hat. The defense attorney shouldn't be trusted. He's representing a bad person, and he's doing everything he can to just get that person, quote unquote, off. Jurors come into the box believing that the prosecutor and the law enforcement agents or sworn law enforcement agents wouldn't tell a lie. And they wouldn't be sponsoring witnesses and evidences if they didn't truly believe in the defendant's guilt. And they believe that the judge's role is to ensure that the conviction comes down. That's what average jurors believe. We see it every day when we go through the jury selection process, where we get to ask prospective jurors questions to kind of fret out any biases or preconceived notions they may have. And while this doesn't happen often, from time to time, we do have some that just flat out come out and tell you, look, the truth of the matter is I don't believe the defendant would be here if he hadn't done anything. He must have done something wrong because he's seated here. And that's very unfortunate. The presumption of innocence doesn't really exist in an American courtroom. I believe it's just the opposite. From the beginning of the trial until the end of the trial, there's a heavy burden on the defendant to prove that he didn't do what the prosecutor claims that he did.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I've heard that as well from a state attorney, I think from New Mexico, I had talked to, and he was a previously prosecutor, and he said the same thing, and I'll get into that. But we do have live comments here on this. So Thomas is somebody that I know in a couple of these groups, and he's been to prison as well for conspiracy to distribute 5 kilos or more of ghost dope. Holly is here joining us, and this is going to be my favorite interview period. He's already spot on. And she works for the public defender's office, so she actually went and did 3 years in the federal system at a camp, and then she got out, and I believe she started working for the lawyer that represented her, and then she ended up going into as a paralegal, and now she's going to school to get her law degree.
Oh man, great! That is a great story.
Yeah, and that's not an I hear that a lot. A lot of people that when they go to prison and they especially folks that are not what you would call the I don't know, like they have means, you know what I mean? Right. It's like exactly. the white collar criminals and stuff like that, or where they got caught up in. They have the means and the support system out there to be able to, when they get out, be able to navigate their life and sort of get it back on track once they pick up the pieces,
right?
You know, and so we got Kevin Haynes. That's correct. I went to trial in the feds. Got another individual there that's been a part of this. Dallas County Public Defender's Office and now law school. Congratulations, Holly. That's amazing that you got accepted, and I know you've been working on that for the last I think you announced it maybe a couple of months ago. So congratulations if I hadn't already told you. So it brings me back to this. So, I mean, you have a lot of different things that are at play here. I mean, not every prosecutor is dirty. Not every judge is, bound by whatever stocks they have interests in that are connected to certain industries.
Right. No doubt about it.
There's a lot of that goes on, and I mean, I believe that there was, I would say probably about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a judge that got caught up
in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, we're sending the youth, the kids, right, the juveniles.
Yeah. It was in Pennsylvania, and Sean, you got to remember, it's not just their direct conflicts that might exist, but they may also have indirect conflicts where. It may not be their money being invested, or they may not directly be deriving benefits, but someone close to them may be. The former law firm that they worked for, or other business associates, or those who may be connected to friends and family. So you have a lot of that going on also. And those are type of connections that are even more difficult to uncover. We might be able to do a search and try to find out what connections, if any, the presiding judge might have to the entire, prison industrial complex system. But it's much more difficult to discern whether or not they're best friends with someone who might have those connections. And they might be looking to benefit their friends, or again, their family members. So it's a very difficult thing. And that's why the whole privatization of the system is just a bad thing. It builds in that incentive for someone to try to get rich off of the misery and someone's liberty being deprived, and it really shouldn't be about that.
No, it shouldn't. I mean, that's a conflict of interest of the worst kind. We got Kevin. You're innocent until proved innocent in the feds. Holly has a question. She wants to know about preponderance of evidence.
Yeah, well, the preponderance of evidence standard is a lower evidentiary standard in our criminal justice system that should not apply to guilt or not guilty. It is, we have to quantify it in a numerical sense. As I tell many of my clients, think of preponderance of evidence as being 50 plus 1%. Whereas in our criminal justice system, at least by theory, beyond a reasonable doubt, if you have to quantify that in numbers, that we're striving for something much higher, 95% or better, many would say. But the reality is that oftentimes jurors get confused by these concepts. Jury instructions are incredibly complex, difficult for lawyers and judges, people who are involved in the system every day, to fully understand and appreciate. So when you bring 12 regular, ordinary citizens where this is not their language that they speak every day, and you read them these jury instructions to include the distinction between preponderance of the evidence versus beyond a reasonable doubt, they get confused. And the reality is, I believe most jurors just think, hey, which side do I think has done a better job in proving whatever side they're advocating? And they don't parse out the difference between a preponderance and a guilty beyond a reasonable doubt standard. Very difficult.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be, especially, since a lot of I mean, I don't know if this is true or not, but I was watching this, I think one of the women that used to work for Alex Jones, and I'm saying Alex Jones, everybody, not that I don't agree with everything that he says, but I mean, he's been pretty right on about a few things. But one of the women that used to work for him, she made a documentary. It's called Shadow World or Shadow something Shadow, but it has to do with the compilation of data about everybody. Yeah. And when it comes to picking juries, what they can do now is they can pick a jury before it actually even gets to you and you're selecting it at the court level. They can pick a jury that's going to give them the outcome that they want based on all the data that they have on these people that they've been getting from Google and every place else that, know what I mean? Because we're constantly being tracked and traced and data based pretty much. Yeah. And so basically what they were doing is, if they want an outcome of guilty, they'll stack that selection full of people that are going to, sway that way. And so when you actually get the jury to select, it's like, well, all right, all of them are going to go a certain way, so you don't really have a lot of choice.
Yes. Well, things certainly has changed with respect to that from when I first started. When I first started, it was before the internet, so before, all of this massive amount of information we now have access to, and you're absolutely correct. And for well-heeled clients who really have the resources to devote to it, you can always bring in jury consultants. You can have focus groups. You can do mock trials before the real trial to see how things are going to play out in front of your selected or preferred jurors. So we are very much more advanced today than what we used to be. I know in my practice, we definitely take advantage of the information that's out there in social media. We research, review Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We try to gather as much information as we can about prospective jurors to see their political leanings, their social views on particular issues that might resonate throughout our trial. And then they become our targets to try to get on the jury. So, this concept that the Constitution talks about a jury of your peers, and it should be just a cross-section of our society, at least today, that's not really true. And both sides are doing it. The prosecutor is doing it. The defense is doing it. It becomes unbalanced when, the prosecutor has ample resources to devote to something like this. But a lot of defendants simply don't. The vast majority of people being prosecuted for offenses in this country, serious as well as petty offenses, are poor, are people who can't afford good, competent legal representation. And even if they can afford the lawyer, they can't afford all the extra pieces that the lawyer might need in order to really do a thorough job. The private investigator, the ability to have an independent review of forensic, ballistic, blood evidence. Very few clients stand in a position to be able to do that. So when we look at some of the outcomes in this country of how some very wealthy people get a certain outcome and those without the same kind of resources get a different kind of outcome, that's often what's at play.
You mentioned something about the blood splatter evidence and all of that stuff, and I was listening to a Joe Rogan episode, and he had on David Fromm and another gentleman from the Innocence Project.
Yeah,
and they're really pushing a lot of that is junk science. like the blood spatter, the bite mark evidence, all of these different things that they throw at you, the prosecution will throw at you. It's not really sound science.
Well, it's always very troubling because on the defense side that if the prosecutor is successful with having that type of evidence admitted, jurors are going to buy it. Jurors are going to believe it, and they are because again, the prosecutor is sponsoring it, the judge is allowing it, and that's all the credibility the average person really needs. And then you also got to recognize that what we see on TV and pulp culture is having an impact too. Ever since NCIS and CSI and all these shows started to come up, it really cuts both ways now. If I'm really honest, when a prosecutor doesn't have that kind of evidence to offer, most jurors now have come to expect it. So if a fingerprint isn't recovered that matches the defendant, that can go a long way in helping you prove reasonable doubt. If there's not biological evidence left there at the scene that matches to the defendant, a lot of time that will help you a lot in order to raising the specter of reasonable doubt. But you're right. I mean, a lot of these sciences that have been developed, I remember in the early days of cell site, cell phone tracking and things of that nature, it's gotten a lot better, and the science supports it more than what it did when it first started. But jurors have been eating that up ever since it first was introduced. They're just inclined to believe it if the judge lets it in.
Yeah, that definitely is a problem, I would say. That's my dog. Hey, shh. Dad's trying to record. Holly had a question down here. She says, knowing the Fed conviction percentage, what would you tell a client facing a sentence and being offered a plea?
Well, look, I always share that information with my clients. It's true that the federal conviction rate is incredibly high. In some districts, as high as 95%. But in pretty much all of them, no lower than 90%. And those are pretty daunting odds. First, you got to put that in perspective. That's 95% of all cases. And the vast majority of cases in the federal system are resolved by plea. So if you take a little bit deeper look behind that number, what you really want to ask yourself is, what is the conviction rate for those people who actually go to trial? And then it gets a little lower. It's still not great, but it is a little better. Now, I encourage all of my clients, if you didn't do what they said you did, then you should go to trial, regardless of what the consequences are. Now, I certainly appreciate and understand that people have to make business decisions, right? You have to decide whether or not, taking the chance of being taken away from your family, going to prison for a very lengthy period of time, or being able to accept what the facts appear to be and mitigate the impact on yourself and your family, and maybe take a plea of convenience. It's unethical for me to encourage you to do that, but I certainly recognize that it does happen. So my advice to all of my clients is, if you didn't do it, let's go to trial. Now, as a consequence of that, I have percentage-wise, I probably go to trial more often than most of my colleagues. Many of my clients seek me out for that reason. I inherit a lot of cases from lawyers who the client becomes frustrated with because they, for whatever reason, believe the lawyer isn't prepared to go to trial, and that's what they want to do. So I think a disproportionate number of my clients actually go to trial.
Yeah, that was one of the things that the attorney I was talking to prior was saying. He's like, there's a couple of different things at play. A lot of it is the culture within the office itself, the culture of winning, and win it all means, and it really doesn't matter how you attain that win. And then also too, that there are some client, because I experienced this. When I knew that there was some stipulations, they have to test the drugs, they had to do all these things. I knew that there was a backlog, And if I didn't waive my rights to a speedy trial, then, 60 days they wouldn't be able to do it within the 60 days, and then they'd have to throw the case out. And I actually caught my public defender working with the prosecutor to extend that. And, we went to court and said, we're going to have to, go another week. And I was like, I don't agree to this. No.
Right.
And they didn't care one bit about what I had to say about it.
Yeah.
They went and did it anyways. And so I brought that up to him, and he goes, well, also too, that there is not every attorney is capable of going to trial.
Right. We're not all the same. I mean, it's no different from any other profession, right? You have good ones, you have bad ones. You have aggressive defense attorneys, and you have not so aggressive defense attorneys. Oftentimes, I tell clients, particularly if they're already represented by counsel, I often will, during my initial consultation, try to get a sense as to what is their objective. Are you looking for just a better plea deal, or are you set to go to trial? Tell me what you're really looking after. If you just want a plea deal, oftentimes I will tell clients that, well, there's a lot easier ways to go about doing that than hiring me. I'm not going to be the least expensive attorney that you might consult with, but my fees often are reflective of the fact that most of the individuals who hire me are looking to go to trial. That's my reputation. That's my standing in the legal community. So that's why many of my clients seek me out. But there are other lawyers who are equally capable to work out a deal for you if that's what you're after.
That's a great answer. Allie popped in. She said, "Excellent, Rob. Hashtag take it to trial." Hi, Allie. Thanks for the plug.
Thank you.
Yeah. So a lot of people can say, you have all these problems with this, and you have all these issues with the conspiracy charge. Well, if you weren't doing anything wrong to begin with, then you wouldn't have to be complaining about this.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons why politically it's not very sexy or attractive to get these laws changed, because that's the public's perception. That's certainly the way politicians feel. They're not interested in doing anything that might help people who find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Again, that presumption of innocence, right? If it truly was there, it wouldn't be viewed that way by average citizens or politicians. You'd understand that just because someone was accused of a crime doesn't mean they actually committed the offense. Mm-hmm. So the law should be fair no matter what. And conspiracy is just one of those wicked weapons in a prosecutor's toolbox, where he doesn't have to prove that you actually committed a substantive offense. That's the scariest thing about it. You can be convicted of a conspiracy offense, even though the supposed substantive offense was never actually completed or even attempted. And I'll give you an example. If you and I sat down and we talked about robbing a bank, and we came up with a plan on how we were going to do it, and let's say that plan included you and I going out and acquiring some ski masks. The time we leave to go to the store to buy the ski mask, if we're arrested at that moment in time, we're miles away from the bank. We haven't even looked at what bank we're going to rob. We could be tried and convicted of conspiracy to commit bank robbery. And all we did was talk about it. But if you take one step toward furthering it, that's it. That's enough. And that one step could be as simple as, well, we're going to need some masks. Let's go buy some masks. We don't even get to the store to buy the masks. The conspiracy offense is completed once we leave our house headed to buy the mask. That's scary.
No, it is. It's real scary. And I mean, we're seeing a lot of stuff now coming out, like with the definition of domestic terrorism.
Yep.
And how the push to that is starting to help. There's a lot of scary things going on right now.
There are, sometimes when these laws come on the books, people don't have the vision to see into the future as to how they might be applied in other situations. And that's what we're seeing with that. And it's not the first time. Originally, the RICO statute was specifically designed to go after organized crime. And now we see it being used in every other aspect, whether it be just a bunch of juveniles who might be involved in a street gang, they get charged with RICO. We see in the white collar situation, high up ranking executives in corporations that might do bad things, they get charged with RICO. That's not the way it was originally conceived when it first got on the books in the late 60s, early 70s. But now we've seen it expanded into other areas. So it does happen from time to time.
What is your percentage of trials won in the federal system?
I've never kept a record like that. What I tell people is, first of all, when you say a win, how do you really define a win, right? So when I have a client who comes with me and he's facing a series of charges, an indictment with 8 or 9 serious felonies, where if convicted, he's going to be looking at a mandatory life sentence. If at the end of the trial, he's convicted of 2 lesser included offenses and he ends up getting a 4-year sentence, if you ask that former client of mine, he will tell you that was a win. Okay?
Yeah.
Still resulted in a conviction, but he would say that was a win. This is a real case I had. I had a client charged with a homicide as well as a firearm violation. He was acquitted of the first-degree murder, which carried mandatory life, but he was convicted of the firearm offense. It was a 3-year offense. He considered that a victory. Sometimes a plea resolution can also be interpreted as a victory for the same reason. If you go through all the pretrial motions and the pretrial steps, and you really get the prosecutor to see the weakness of their case, or the judge to appreciate the weakness of the case, and at the end of the day, you extract a plea that the client who was looking at 20 years now walks away with a deal for 18 months, he probably would interpret that as a win also.
Great answer. Good comeback. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No problem.
It really is. I mean, I didn't even think about it that way.
Yeah. Well, I get asked the question a lot. What's your, especially during initial consultations? I said, well, that's difficult to say. Now, when you say a win, tell me what you mean by a win. If you mean just a straight acquittal, then again, now we got to talk about what kind of cases we're talking about. All right. Are we talking about homicide cases? Are we talking about drug offenses? Are we talking about, white collar crime cases? Because the experience is going to be different. So let's talk about your particular situation. Then I'll be able to give you a more detailed answer. That's what I normally tell clients.
Yeah, when I was going through mine, the whole experience from the beginning to the end seemed like one giant indirect coercion.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of pressure. And, it starts from the time that you're arrested. That kind of subtle pressure that's placed on you. It starts with your bond consideration. Statistically, prosecutors know this, judges know this, and certainly cops know this, that if a defendant is held pre-trial in jail, the likelihood that that person is going to plead guilty skyrockets. And it's because they're being denied their liberty, they've lost their employment, they're cut off from their family, they can't provide for their children, and all they have is 24 hours a day to think about what the future is going to look like if they are convicted and if they receive a very long sentence. My clients who are able to be released on bond, that same pressure is not there, at least not to the same level. They're able to go on at least with some semblance of their ordinary life. They're not really, quote unquote, feeling it yet. And they're more likely to go to trial, to not waive their rights, and to stand strong and go to trial. So because prosecutors and cops and judges all know this, they know that the starting ground to start putting pressure on the defendant is to have him held without bond.
Mm-hmm. Also, too, I noticed this a lot, too, when I talk to different people, is stacking charges.
Yeah.
To bump up your bail.
Yeah.
You know,
no doubt about it. Prosecutors know that at the state level, especially in the federal level. We have certain cases that are called presumptive cases, where judges are instructed by the law that if you're charged with a certain offense under particular considerations, they are to presume that there are no conditions of bond that would be appropriate. So that places the power in the prosecutor's hand. He knows that if he charges you with this particular offense, that the likelihood that you will get out on bond is certainly reduced. And he also knows that if you're held without bond, the likelihood that you're going to ultimately cave and plead guilty also goes up.
So another question I have is, well, first I'm gonna formulate a question here, but I want to hear what got you to want to become an attorney to begin with, and why did you pick the federal trajectory?
Well, for as long as I could remember, it's always been a career goal of mine, going way back to when I was a kid, growing up in Charleston, South Carolina. I didn't grow up with much. Didn't grow up in a rich family, a middle income family. I grew up in a poor family. Most of my childhood was spent growing up in public housing, and all the bad things that go along with that, and growing up in an impoverished neighborhood. A lot of crime, a lot of interactions with police officers in my neighborhood and things like that. And a lot of family members who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. I saw a lot of abuses growing up as a child on how they were being treated, how our community was being policed. And I wanted to, and I was attracted to doing something that could be of assistance to people like that, people from my own community. As a kid, I also watched a lot of TV. Probably did that more than anything else. And I always had an attraction to those TV shows that were about legal dramas. I watched Perry Mason growing up as a kid, that grew into Matlock as a kid, LA Law. Shows like that always fascinated me. Now I'm really telling on myself my age, right? Because I know many of your listeners and viewers probably never even heard of those shows, or even if they heard of them, never actually watched them. But I did. And so my definition of a lawyer was what I saw on the TV screen. And that was someone in a suit in a courtroom. I didn't even know that there were other ways you could put a law degree to use. Being a trial lawyer to me was the definition of being a lawyer. Now, it's also true that growing up without a lot of money, everybody who grows up in a situation like that dreams of the day that they could be in a situation where they have money. And being a lawyer looked like a pretty good way to make a living. Didn't look like a bad way. So that's what really brought me to wanting to be a lawyer. Now, the federal criminal defense side started really after I got out of law school, after I graduated, after I had passed the bar and started out in my career. I quickly started to admire those lawyers who practiced in federal court. There was just something a little bit cut above with those lawyers. They just seemed to have more prominent reputations, and people always thought of them as being the top cream of the crop, if you will. And I was attracted to that. So when I started my career, I made my way to the local federal courthouse and started trying to consume everything I could about how I could one day get my foot in the door. So that's always been attractive to me.
That's awesome, man. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
John Esteen says, "Nice show, Sean." John actually was on the news, and it was another individual that was on a conspiracy charge, I believe, and did 20 plus or almost 20 years. I'm not really sure of his story. I haven't had him on my show yet. I'm supposed to. But there's a lot of folks, man, that I'm in contact with and that I talk to that, I mean, they're no stranger to any of the things that we're talking about, and most of them have been victims of it. Yeah. And just like the folks out of the Northern District of Texas, it is, it's like anytime that I think of stuff, like I've interviewed a gentleman, or actually a couple of people that were involved in a true crime documentary series. They were the producers of it and did it all. It's called The Con. And it was about, the 2008 financial crisis and actually how it was kind of played out, what The Big Short didn't tell you, and all the whistleblowers. And you probably know or are familiar with some of these folks that tried to blow the whistle from the Department of Justice. And, when you're in a bureaucracy, whatever you do only goes as high as the next person above you.
That's right.
Yeah, and so if some of these folks are, you're bringing it to their attention and they're not saying anything about it, or they're not taking it to that next level, then it just sort of dies with them.
Yeah. Well, one of the real tragedies that came out of that 2008 financial crisis meltdown, and what we see happen sometime, is that the political response to it sometimes leads to even more injustice in our criminal justice system, because there was such political pressure put on the Department of Justice to start prosecuting people who they thought were responsible or had contributed to that whole mortgage scheme meltdown that the country experienced. That you had a lot of good people who may have done something very small, maybe gray in nature, with maybe putting something on their mortgage application that may not have been 100% accurate, but it didn't really affect the mortgage decision, whether or not they truly qualified for the loan. They found themselves being prosecuted because, the Department of Justice back then, that was their mandate, to go out and find as many as they can cases of people who they thought, were responsible for, causing the crisis. And it wasn't people like that really caused the crisis. It was much more people far higher up on the food chain, if you will, that were truly responsible for it. But I had quite a few clients who ended up coming my way, who were low-level players, bit role players, lenders, mortgage brokers, even appraisers, people down that low who got caught up in it. Oftentimes, conspiracy charges.
Yeah, and when I watched that, it kind of painted or diagrammed out, what you had the big banks that were Wall Street that was wanting all these subprime mortgages. That's and right. There was a call for it, and they were incentivizing.
Everybody was making money.
Yeah, everybody was being incentivized, from the appraisers all the way up. And so, yeah, that's really crazy when you really start to look at how complex that is. And then most of the time, the guys that are at the top at Goldman Sachs and some of these other places, the way I look at it is like, okay, well, you're getting ready to get chased down an alley, right? And all of a sudden, you topple a bunch of stuff so nobody can you make a diversion. Well, that diversion is usually the low level players, and then the big guys get away.
That's right.
Or they're politically connected. And then we go into that whole thing.
Sean, it always comes down to resources.
Mm-hmm.
All right? The more resources you have in this country, the better off you're going to be. And that certainly applies to our criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't dispel or doubt the fact that the system prides itself on not, that those things aren't supposed to impact what really happens and what goes on in the courtroom. But the reality is that it does. Okay, there have been parts of my career where I wasn't always an attorney for hire. I represented court-appointed clients. I lived under those restrictions and limitations not being able to afford certain resources to put toward the defense. Or even if the resources were made available, they certainly had limitations to them. Whereas at this point in my career, I don't really operate under those restraints. So it's easier for me to produce a better outcome now than when you have those type of restraints. And those limitations are going to be there, right? The federal government isn't going to pay but so much money for your defense if you have the services of a court-appointed lawyer or the public defender. That's just the reality, okay? But if you have an unlimited or near unlimited amount of financial resources, human resources, political connections, and you can bring it all to bear, oftentimes you're going to get a better result.
Yeah, that does make sense, and I do remember hearing that, especially when I started digging into those cases in the Northern District of Texas. Is a lot of their court-appointed attorneys, you kind of have to toe a line, because if you rub somebody the wrong way, you rub the courts the wrong way, they'll pull you off that list and they won't give you any more jobs.
Yeah, and and unfortunately, we have some lawyers who are on the Criminal Justice Act panel list that you refer to, that's their livelihood. And you can't, frown upon them doing things to protect their own livelihood. It makes sense. In the DC area, knowing what the average, retained counsel would charge for particular cases, comparing that to what the current CJA rate is, court-appointed rate is in the District of Columbia, it's about 15 to 20% of what a privately retained lawyer on average would command for the same case. And that's just for his services. Again, that does not include all the other extras that he's going to need to really do a good job for you. That doesn't include the private investigator and other experts that might be needed. So it's difficult to produce the same brand of justice when you're operating under those limitations.
Sounds really messy.
Well, it is. It is.
So, oh man, I had a question on my mind. It just slipped me. Oh, there it was. Here it goes. So, you're about to become really busy here once all the dust settles from these PPE loans and everything else that were rolled out, and the paycheck protection. I don't know what the E was.
Paycheck protection program. In fact, yeah. I have a case right now in the Eastern District of Virginia that came out of both of those situations. Alleged fraud, wire fraud in connection with the federal government giving out contracts for vendors to supply personal protective equipment to the federal government so it could be distributed around the country. Much of it was done in a very haste manner, and the normal due diligence was not applied. And as a consequence, now we're seeing a lot of cases flow through the system right now. Got my first one about 6 months ago. And the same thing with the payroll protection program. We've got that going on too. Again, it was rushed through. The normal due diligence was not exercised. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of people who got some of those loans maybe didn't precisely qualify under the criteria. A lot of people rushed to apply, thinking that the loans would automatically be forgiven, which is not true. The loans are eligible for forgiveness. And a lot of people don't understand that they are subject to an audit that can come at any point in time within the next 3 years. So just because you got the loan today and no one has contacted you about whether or not you truly qualify, that doesn't mean within the next 3 years you won't be contacted by an auditor who wants to go over your books and assure that you actually did properly qualify. So we're going to be dealing with this for years to come.
Man. Whew, glad I didn't go for one of those.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean,
the one that I have was reported on in our local news. The alleged amount of the fraud was $36.4 million.
wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
So we're at about where are we? About 50 minutes now. Where do you how do you have any idea or any thoughts on how we can fix any of this, like the criminal justice reform? I mean, we've got the 94 crime bill that was enacted, and that which actually,
President Biden's role. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, he was the one that authored it, but Bill Clinton's the one that actually passed it.
That's right.
So, I mean, you can say whatever you want, and I have my own thoughts about how all this stuff shook out, and they all kind of coincided and worked together with the privatization of prisons.
Well, remember, it was supported by the Congressional Black Caucus. I mean, they were all on board too. So, there's a lot of blame to go around. How do you fix it? Mm-hmm. Well, I always remind people that, politicians respond to the will of the people. And whether that is rich people or just, a number of people. But the point is that they take their lead from the people who put them in office. And I'll let you define who that is. Mm-hmm. And so they can be had, they can be impacted. If we don't like the job that they're doing, then we've got to use our power at the ballot box to get some new folks in there. And I know a lot of people will say, well, that can't happen because it's all about money or it's all about special interests and whatnot. I would say if you look at 2008, I think that proves differently when Barack Obama was elected. I certainly believe November the 3rd of 2020 proved otherwise too. Who would have thought that Georgia would have turned out the way it did? Who would have thought that the election would have played out the way it did? Not just that the result was what it was, but how it played out. Some traditional red states, solid red states, turned blue because people came out and let their will be known. And we've got to do the same thing. This notion that anything that helps people who are accused of committing crimes is automatically a bad thing. We've got to get rid of that. I know a lot of people are down on the Trump administration, and I'm no defender of the Trump administration. But I tell you, whether it was because he was motivated, because he had so many friends of his who found themselves being prosecuted, the Trump administration did some pretty favorable things to help improve the criminal justice system. The CARES Act, compassionate release. Those were things that came out of his administration. Now, again, what his motivation was, I won't speculate about that. But it shows that politicians can be had. You got to use your power, your voice to get to them, to make the changes that we all need.
Are you familiar with Amy Candu?
I'm not.
Candu Clemency.
Okay.
Yeah, she's. I've had her on my show, and she helped get a lot of people out on the CARES Act and get it through clemency and all that other stuff. How do we? A lot of the problems that I see, or that I feel like we're going through, are a direct result of qualified immunity. And if you're not held accountable to upholding a certain standard of behavior, from prosecutorial misconduct to, all of the other stuff that goes along, even with the judges to the police officers that get you in there. If there's no accountability, then what's there to incentivize you to do a good job?
Yeah, well, qualified immunity certainly is something that, I hope, grows out of the current call for criminal justice reform. It's terrible that so many young Black men, like George Floyd had to lose their lives, for many people in this country to wake up and realize that we needed criminal justice reform. And certainly, as a consequence of particularly his case and his death, we started to re-examine all over the country this notion of qualified immunity and being able to hold law enforcement officers to the same standard that you and I are held to every day. If we go out and you or I cause injury to someone intentionally or due to our negligence, we could be sued out of our livelihood. We could, be held accountable. And law enforcement officers shouldn't be treated any differently. They also should be held accountable when, again, they commit criminal conduct, when due to their negligence, people are injured. It should be the same for them as it is for you and I.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that statement. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. If you want to follow Robert on his social media, you got the Instagram right there on the screen. All of this information, all my links, like I said before, will be available in the show notes if you're on the podcast app platforms, or in the description in YouTube, on YouTube or Facebook. We got his Twitter account too as well. Is there anything that you'd like to, any burning desires that you want to get out there before we end this?
Well, Sean, I just want to thank you for having me on, and for your listeners. It was a great time. I always love talking about the criminal justice system. While I might be one of its vocal critics, the truth of the matter is I love the system. I criticize it because I want it to be better. I want it to live up to the ideals that it so often espouses. We can be better. We can do better.
Absolutely. And I have one question, one more, not a question, but a request. I'm starting actually I did start a nonprofit, and I'm a 501c3 now, and I'm going to start working with juvenile transitional youth males in my county. And your story, because you came from that but rose above it, would be very impactful to present and have you talk to some of these guys I get my everything situated.
I would love to do it. I try to do that type of outreach and mentoring every opportunity I get, because there were many who touched my life early on and assured that I would take the path that I took and wouldn't get gobbled up by the system. So if I can pay it back in any way, shape, or form, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, and I appreciate it. So we're going to go ahead and close this out with the outro. Go ahead and I'm going to pull us out, and I'm going to talk to you real quick on the bottom. Right. Everybody, thank you for stopping by and checking out the show. I appreciate it. We got one more tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Morgan Dene, and she is a trauma specialist and core dance. Her name is like Gaia Dancer or something like that, but she'll be on tomorrow at 6 p.m. So until then, thank you for listening. Thank you for stopping by, and I hope you have a great evening.
You've been listening to the Nowhere to Go But Up podcast. Sean is a single dad, a union blue-collar guy, and he spent time in federal and state prison for drug trafficking and fraud. When he was released from prison in 2006, all he had was the clothes on his back, a bag of mail, and some paperwork. Since then, he's turned his life around and shares the struggles and successes on this podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we hope you were moved. To connect to the show, book a guest spot. For merch, Patreon, PayPal, and social media links, go to linktr.ee/nowhere to go but up. On Instagram at Nowhere to Go But Up Now. On Twitter at But Up Now. On the YouTube channel at Nowhere to Go But Up Podcast. See you next time.